Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. My life until Stacy arrived was a series of silent days. I lived alone in a modest but tidy apartment, and my job as a graphic designer allowed me to spend most of my time in the company of my own thoughts. It wasn't a solitary existence by choice, but by a kind of inertia. I had grown used to the silence, to the absence of another breath in the darkness of the night. When I met Stacy, it felt as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for years. She brought with her a warmth and a laugh that dispelled the stillness of my routine. She was intelligent, kind, and had a sadness in her eyes that, instead of pushing me away, made me want to protect her. There was something fragile about her, a wound in her past that she never spoke about in detail. I only knew that she had lost her previous partner, Marco, a couple of years ago, and that the pain was still a persistent shadow. Our relationship blossomed with a speed that surprised us both. Soon the idea of her moving into my apartment went from being a distant possibility to an urgent need. I wanted to fill every corner of my silent existence with her presence. The day she moved in was one of the happiest of my life. She didn't bring many things: a couple of suitcases with clothes, a box of books, and a small, dark, finely carved wooden box that looked much older than the rest of her belongings. She held it with special care. "What's this?" I asked. "Just some memories," she replied, her smile tinged with a fleeting melancholy. She placed it on the highest shelf in the living room, almost hidden among my books. She asked me, please, to never open it. It was the only thing she kept from her previous life. I respected her wish without asking any more questions, happy that this little box was the only remnant of a past we could now begin to leave behind together. The first few weeks were idyllic. The apartment, which had previously been just a place to sleep, became a home. We cooked together, watched movies late into the night, and filled the silence with conversations and plans for the future. The sadness in Stacy's eyes seemed to fade day by day. I believed, with the naive certainty of someone in love, that we had closed the door on any shadows from the past. The first anomaly was so subtle I almost dismissed it as a technical glitch. I was watching television one night, alone in the living room. Stacy had gone to bed early, exhausted from work. In the middle of a line of dialogue from the movie, the TV's audio crackled like a bad signal. And for a split second, underneath the actors' voices, I heard a whisper. It was a man's voice, deep and filled with cold anger. I didn't understand the words, only the emotion. It lasted an instant and was gone. I turned up the volume, rewound the scene. There was nothing. I blamed it on interference, on cross signals. I gave it no more thought. A few days later, it happened again. I was listening to music on the smart speaker in the kitchen while making dinner. Stacy was in the shower. In the middle of a quiet song, the music distorted with a burst of static, and again, the same male voice, a low, threatening growl that seemed to say a single word: out. The sound cut off as quickly as it had come, leaving the song playing as if nothing had happened. My blood ran cold. I turned off the music. The only sound was the running water in the bathroom. I looked around the kitchen feeling like an idiot. I was starting to get spooked. But I noticed something. The static, the whisper, only ever appeared when I was alone in the common areas near the living room, where Stacy had left her wooden box. The phenomena soon moved from the auditory to the physical. One morning, entering the living room, I found the picture frame we kept on the coffee table, one with a photo of us laughing, face down on the wood. "Stacy, did you touch the photo?" I asked. She shook her head, puzzled. "Maybe it fell over in a draft," she said, though we both knew there had been no draft that night. A couple of days later, It was something more violent. I had given Stacy a small ceramic vase with an orchid in it. We left it on the living room windowsill. In the morning, we found it shattered on the floor, the flower broken and soil scattered across the rug. This time, the excuse of a draft sounded ridiculous. Stacy turned very pale. "I'm sorry, it was my fault. I must have left it too close to the edge," she said, her voice trembling as she picked up the pieces. But I had seen where she put it. It had been perfectly centered. Something had pushed it. And it wasn't a blind force. These were acts with a clear intention, small, petty attacks aimed at the symbols of our happiness. Fear began to settle in me, a cold tenant in my own home. I started watching the wooden box on the shelf with a mixture of dread and fascination. It seemed to be the epicenter of it all. I asked Stacy about it again, more insistently this time. She shut down completely. "Please, let's not talk about it," she pleaded. "It's the past, and the past should stay buried." The first time I saw him, I knew I wasn't losing my mind. I woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty. I left the bedroom quietly so as not to wake Stacy. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the living room window. And then I saw him. Standing in the gloom of the living room was a silhouette. It was that of a tall, burly man, motionless, staring directly at our bedroom door. It wasn't a shadow. It had a density, a physical presence that seemed to absorb what little light there was. I froze, my heart in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, but I felt its hatred, a wave of malice so pure and concentrated it made me take a step back. The floorboard creaked under my foot. In that instant, the figure dissolved, like black smoke scattered by an invisible wind. I ran to the switch and flipped on the light. The living room was empty, but the cold it left behind was real, and so was the hatred. I didn't say anything to Stacy. How could I tell her I had seen a man in our living room in the middle of the night? A man who wasn't of this world? She would think I was crazy. Or worse, she'd be so scared she would leave. And the thought of returning to my silent life from before was, at that moment, almost more terrifying than the ghost itself. I decided to pretend nothing was wrong, that it was all in my head. The point of no return came a week later. It was our 6-month anniversary. I wanted it to be special. I bought her a necklace, a thin silver chain with a small moonstone pendant. I left it on her pillow for her to find when she went to bed. That night, her smile when she saw it was the cure for all my anxieties. She put it on and didn't take it off. We fell asleep in each other's arms, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely safe. We were woken by a violent crash from the living room, as if an entire bookshelf had come crashing down. We jumped out of bed and ran in. The scene was one of deliberate chaos. Stacy's wooden box was on the floor, open. Its contents, a few letters tied with a ribbon, a dried flower, and an old photograph, were scattered on the floor. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Instinctively, I looked at the bookshelf. It hadn't fallen. Everything was in its place. The noise hadn't been real, just a way to get us out of bed. We went back to the bedroom, bewildered. And then I saw it. On the nightstand, where Stacy had left her earrings, was the thin silver chain I had given her. It was broken. Not dropped, not tangled. It was broken in 3 pieces, as if invisible, furious hands had ripped it from her neck while she slept and torn it apart with pure rage. I looked at Stacy. She was touching her neck, her eyes filled with a terror I had never seen before. "It's gone," she whispered. I was wearing the necklace, I was wearing it. The message was unmistakable. It was a direct attack, a violation of our intimacy, of our safest space. I looked at the broken necklace, then at the open box in the living room, and finally at Stacy. Her past wasn't buried. It was in our home, and it hated us. The broken necklace was the turning point. Denial shattered, revealing raw terror. Stacy collapsed, crying silently, a reaction that wasn't just fear, but a profound exhaustion, as if she were reliving an old trauma. We cleaned up the mess in the living room in an unbearable tension. I begged her to tell me the truth. "Whose box is that, Stacy? What is happening?" But she refused, her lips sealed by a fear older than the one she felt for me. "It's just Marco," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of air. Sometimes he just won't leave me alone." It was the first time she had spoken his name in my presence, and the name seemed to hang in the air, heavy and cold. I didn't want to push her any further. Seeing her so fragile and scared awoke a protective instinct in me that drowned out my own panic. I decided that if she couldn't face her past, I would do it for her. From that night on, the presence in the apartment abandoned all subtlety. It became clear that its target was me. The specter's anger was aimed exclusively at me. The voices in the static became clear and personal. When Stacy wasn't there, I would hear his voice on the radio or in the hum of the refrigerator. They were short, venomous phrases. "Get out. She's mine. I'm going to kill you." The feeling of being watched was constant, a pressure on the back of my neck that never went away. I started seeing his silhouette more often, always in my peripheral vision, a tall, broad shadow that would vanish if I tried to look at it directly. The poltergeist activity became more aggressive. One afternoon, as I was working on a design on my computer, the screen flickered. The lines of code I was writing were erased and replaced by a single word that typed itself. Death. I froze, staring at the screen. Before I could react, the laptop was swept off the table by an invisible force and slammed against the opposite wall, shattering into pieces. My work tools, my connection to the outside world, destroyed in an instant. I tried to leave the apartment to get some air, to escape the oppression, but when I turned the knob on the front door, it wouldn't move. It was held shut by an unnatural force. I pulled. I slammed against it, but it was like pushing a steel wall. The metallic sound of a deadbolt being thrown, a deadbolt that didn't exist, echoed in the silence. I was trapped. Panic flooded me as I heard a muffled, mocking laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I backed away from the door, realizing the cage had been locked. These were attacks designed to wear me down, to isolate me, to make me paranoid and fearful in my own home. And it was working. I barely slept. I lost weight. My world had shrunk to the space of that apartment. My relationship with Stacy began to suffer. The constant tension was like a poison. She saw my fear, my exhaustion, and felt guilty, which made her withdraw even more. I, for my part, started to feel an irrational resentment toward her. It was her past that was destroying us, her silence that was keeping us from fighting back. The arguments became more frequent, always over trivial things, but we both knew the real cause was the fear and helplessness we felt. Marco's shadow wasn't just haunting us, it was tearing us apart. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to understand who Marco was, not Stacy's idealized or feared memory, but the real man. One night while she was sleeping soundly, overcome by emotional exhaustion, I did something I'm ashamed of. I opened the wooden box. The letters inside weren't love letters. They were notes of apology, written in an erratic hand. "Forgive me for last night. It won't happen again. I didn't mean to hurt you. I promise I'll change." They were the words of an abuser. The photograph was of Stacy and a burly man with a forced smile and possessive eyes. It was him, the shadow from the living room. On the back of the photo, there was a date. I searched online. Marco hadn't died in a car accident, as Stacy had vaguely implied. A local newspaper article was brief. Man dies after falling from a balcony in an apparent domestic accident. The address was Stacy's old apartment. The article mentioned that the police had been called to the apartment on several previous occasions for domestic disturbance calls. I found a small local news forum from that time. A person claiming to be a neighbor had commented anonymously, They said the arguments were constant, that you could hear things being thrown and crying, but no one wanted to get involved. On the night of the fall, the shouting was worse than ever. Then a sharp thud, and silence. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Marco wasn't a victim. He was a monster. And his nature hadn't changed with death. His spirit wasn't trapped by unfinished business. It was anchored by its own malice, by its inability to let go of what it considered its. His possessiveness was so strong, it had transcended death. With this new information, I decided to confront Stacy. The next morning, I showed her the letters and the news article. At first, she tried to deny it, but seeing the determination in my eyes, she broke down. She told me everything. Marco had been her tormentor. He isolated her from her friends, from her family. He controlled her, humiliated her, and sometimes he hit her. She described one night when he, furious because she had spoken to an old friend, smashed every plate in the kitchen one by one, forcing her to watch. She said his eyes in that moment didn't seem human. On the night he died, he had come home drunk, in an even more violent, jealous rage. The argument escalated. He cornered her on the balcony, threatening to throw her off. She, in an act of pure desperation, pushed him. He lost his balance, stumbled, and fell. It was an accident born of an act of self-defense, but she had lived every day since with the guilt and the terror that someone would find out the truth. She kept the box not out of love, but as a reminder of her survival, a kind of macabre talisman that, without her knowing, was keeping the door open for his ghost. As Stacy spoke, as her confession filled the air of the living room, the atmosphere changed. The temperature plummeted, and an icy vapor came from our mouths. The lights in the room flickered violently and then exploded, plunging us into the morning gloom. And then, in the center of the room, the shadows that had been pooling in the corners seemed to flow toward the middle, converging and swirling. A smell of ozone and a grave-like cold filled the air. The shadow that had been stalking me began to take shape. It stopped being a silhouette and became an almost solid, translucent figure, a whirlwind of black smoke and hatred. It was Marco. His face was contorted in an inhuman snarl of fury, his features constantly melting and reforming like in a nightmare. He wasn't looking at both of us. He was looking at me. He raised a trembling arm and pointed in my direction. Across the room, a heavy oak bookshelf tilted forward, ripping from the wall with a crack of wood and plaster, and crashed to the floor right where I had been sitting a second ago. I rolled across the floor to dodge it, the sound of the impact ringing in my ears. The message was clear. He no longer wanted to scare me. He wanted to wipe me from existence. We were cornered in a corner of the room, Stacy screaming my name, while the figure of Marco, crackling with a dark energy, advanced slowly toward us. Her past had finally come to reclaim her, and to destroy me in the process. The crash of the bookshelf jolted us out of our stupor. Marco's ghost advanced, its flickering form distorting the air around it. It didn't walk. It glided, and with every foot it drew closer, the cold became more intense, a cold that ached in the bones. Fear screamed at me to run, but seeing Stacy beside me, paralyzed by terror, her face a mask of panic, I knew fleeing wasn't an option. The entity wasn't tied to the apartment, it was tied to her. Wherever we went, he would follow. I grabbed Stacy's hand and pulled her out of the living room, dodging the small objects that were beginning to levitate and shoot at us like projectiles. A book hit me in the head, making me see stars. We slammed the bedroom door behind us and blocked it with a dresser. I knew it wouldn't do much good. We could hear his growls of fury on the other side, and the sound of his invisible fists pounding on the wood with thunderous force. We needed a plan. We were trapped, besieged by an entity whose only motivation was hatred. I remembered something I'd read in the news about his death. Marco was pathologically possessive. His attacks always focused on the symbols of our relationship, on the things that represented me in Stacy's life. His power, His anchor to this world was his obsession. If we could break that obsession, maybe we could break his power. The box. Everything had started with the box. Those objects weren't just memories. They were the shackles that kept Marco chained to Stacy. "Look," I said, my voice choked with panic. "We have to destroy the box. Its contents. It's the only thing keeping him here." Stacy looked at me, her eyes full of tears and a terrible doubt. "I can't," she whispered. "It's the only thing I have left of..." She didn't have to finish the sentence. I understood the traumatic bond that tied her to those objects. "They're an anchor, Stacy," I said, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Not for your memory, but for his hatred. As long as you don't destroy them, you'll never be free, and he'll never let me live." The bedroom door began to splinter under the blows. We didn't have time. Determination appeared on her face, replacing the fear. She nodded. We went out the other bedroom door, the one that led to the kitchen. The apartment was in chaos. Drawers were open, dishes smashed, the air filled with furious whispers. We had to get to the living room, get the box, and destroy its contents. The plan was simple. I would distract him. She would go for the objects. I entered the living room first. Marco's figure was floating in the center of the room, his attention fixed on the splintering bedroom door. He saw me, and all his fury focused on me. With a roar that sounded like twisting metal, he lunged in my direction. He couldn't touch me directly, but the force of his presence threw me backward, like an explosion of compressed air. I hit the wall and fell to the floor, breathless. As I struggled to get up, I saw Stacy run toward the box scattered on the floor. She started gathering the letters, the photo. The specter noticed. He turned toward her, forgetting about me for an instant. "No!" His ethereal voice screamed, a sound that scratched at my brain. "Mine." He swooped down on her. I got up and threw the only weapon I could find at him, a floor lamp. The object passed through him without doing any harm, but it distracted him long enough. He turned back to me, his smoke-like eyes burning with an infernal rage. This time the attack was more direct. The cord of a broken lamp on the floor animated like a snake and coiled around my ankle, pulling me down and dragging me across the floor toward the broken glass from the lights that had exploded. As I fought against the cord, kicking and pulling, I saw Stacy run to the fireplace with the letters and the photo in her hand. The fireplace wasn't lit, but there was always a box of matches on the mantel. I saw her searching frantically, her hands shaking. The specter divided itself. Part of its energy was still attacking me, tightening the cord on my leg, while its main form moved toward Stacy to stop her. He was about to reach her. She wasn't going to make it. Then, with a final surge of adrenaline, I grabbed one of the pieces of the broken bookshelf and slammed it down on the cord trapping me, freeing myself. "Stacy, run!" I yelled. She found the matches. The first one didn't light. Neither did the second. A gust of icy wind born from nowhere blew it out instantly. The ghost was 3 feet from her, reaching out a shadowy hand to snatch the memories away. On the third try, Stacy shielded the flame with her body. Without hesitating, she set the letters on fire. The instant the old yellowed pages caught fire, Marco's specter let out a heart-rending shriek. It was not a sound of this world. It was a cry of pure psychic agony that made the windows vibrate. His figure began to flicker violently like a bad TV signal. He clutched his head, his form dissolving and reforming in spasms of black smoke. Stacy, crying but resolute, threw the burning letters into the fireplace and added the photograph. As Marco's face on the paper blackened and curled from the heat, the ghost in the center of the room convulsed, unleashing one last wave of fury. All the remaining furniture rose into the air for a second and then dropped at once with a deafening crash. The specter expanded, filling the room with darkness and cold for an instant, and then contracted in on itself like a dying star, disappearing with a final whisper of hatred that faded into nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. The cold vanished instantly, replaced by the warmth of the small flames in the fireplace. The air no longer felt heavy and oppressive, but light. It was over. We were alone. Months have passed. We moved out of that apartment. We couldn't keep living with the memory of what had happened within those walls. We live somewhere else now, a smaller place, but full of light. Stacy is a different person. The shadow in her eyes is gone. She's in therapy, talking about what happened, not just with Marco, but with the ghost. She's healing. She's free. Our love, forged in terror, has become unbreakable. We've built something new on the ashes of her past, but I am forever changed. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up and watch her sleep, just to make sure we're really alone. I've developed an aversion to radio static and can't stand to look at old photographs. They give me an echo of that cold. I've learned that some things don't truly die, that hatred and possessiveness can be anchors stronger than life itself. Every time I hear static or see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, I feel a memory of that terror. The world doesn't seem like such a solid place to me anymore. I know there are cracks, places where the darkness of the past seeps through. And even though Marco's shadow is gone, his memory taught me a terrible lesson. Sometimes the real horror isn't the ghost that's haunting you, but the past that the person you love can't escape. And what I learned is that by fighting for her, by facing her ghost, I faced my own loneliness. And though the scars of fear will never completely disappear, it was worth it. Because the silence in our new home isn't the silence of emptiness, it's the silence of peace. The news of my great-uncle's death reached me in a letter bearing the letterhead of a law firm from a town I'd never even heard of. I barely remembered him. My only memory was a fleeting visit when I was a child, a trip to a dark house that smelled of old paper and something else, something like incense. He was a tall, silent man with eyes that seemed to look right through you. He gave me a leather-bound book of children's stories, and I never heard from him again. My current life was a wasteland of predictable routines, a dead-end office job, and a small apartment where silence was my only companion. The letter, therefore, was a strange interruption, a stone tossed into the stagnant waters of my existence. It mentioned that I was the sole heir. The trip to the town was like stepping back in time. The roads narrowed, modern buildings gave way to stone structures, and neon signs were replaced by wrought iron signs. The law firm was as old as the rest of the town. The lawyer, an old man with slow gestures, explained the terms of the inheritance. My great-uncle Elias had bequeathed me his property, a bookstore called The Hidden Reader, and the apartment located above it. The news stunned me. An entire bookstore. But there was a condition. To take full possession of the inheritance, I had to live in the apartment and personally manage the bookstore for 1 full year. If I abandoned the place or tried to sell it before the year was up, the property and all its contents would be turned over to a discreet local historical society. It seemed like an eccentricity, the last wish of a lonely man who didn't want his legacy to be lost. Trapped in a life that offered me nothing, the idea of a year off in a quiet place, surrounded by books, seemed like an unexpected gift. I accepted. The bookstore was on the main street, a narrow, dark 3-story building wedged between a hardware store and a bakery. The facade was dark stone, with a large, dust-covered picture window that barely hinted at the mountains of books inside. As I opened the door, a set of brass bells chimed with a muffled echo and the smell hit me. It was the concentrated scent of a century of paper, leather, and dust, a thick, almost overwhelming fragrance. The inside was a labyrinth. The shelves reached to the ceiling, so packed that books leaned at precarious angles. There were stacks on the floor, on chairs, on the counter. It was the chaos of a lonely, obsessive mind. The apartment upstairs was just as austere, with functional furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts awaiting my arrival. Everything was permeated by the same dense silence that seemed to emanate from the pages of the thousands of books below. My first goal was to bring some order to the place. I started with the counter, a heavy oak monstrosity in the center of the shop. The first few days passed in a cloud of dust. I sorted books, cleaned shelves, and tried to draw a mental map of the chaos. The town was quiet, too quiet. People would greet me with nods, but their gazes were curious, appraising. They seemed to know more about me than I did myself. Customers started arriving after a few days. They weren't typical readers. They were old, slow-moving people in dark clothes who entered the shop in silence. They didn't browse. They would approach the counter and ask for strange titles, books on ancient cosmology, treatises on alchemy, texts in Latin. I would look up the volumes in my uncle's records and find them in the darkest, most forgotten corners of the shop. The customers paid in cash, barely saying a word, and would leave. But before they left, they always gave me the same look, an intense, almost feverish gaze, as if they were expecting something from me. A week after my arrival, I made the first unsettling discovery. I was trying to move a heavy bookshelf in the back room to clean behind it. With a great effort, I managed to pull it a few inches from the wall. On the discolored plaster, I saw a mark. It was a symbol painted with a dark, almost black pigment. A circle with 7 spokes that curved inward, and in the center, a kind of jagged spiral. It was a complex and strangely organic design. I wrote it off as some old decoration, another of my Uncle Elias's eccentricities. I pushed the bookshelf back into place, but the image of the symbol was seared into my mind. From that moment on, I started seeing it everywhere. It was a subtle, almost subliminal mark. I found it embossed on the leather cover of an untitled book, stamped on the spine of an old astronomy atlas, and even finely carved into the underside of one of the counter legs. Every time I found it, I felt the same inexplicable chill, as if I were deciphering a code I wasn't meant to understand. The bookstore wasn't just a collection of books, it was a map, and the symbol was the key. The true nature of my inheritance began to reveal itself when I decided to sort through my uncle's personal desk in the small office in the back room. It was an old desk, full of secret compartments. In one of them, triggered by a hidden spring, I found a heavy black leather-bound ledger. When I opened it, the smell of old paper was replaced by a metallic scent, almost like dried blood. It wasn't a sales ledger. Its pages were filled with names written in an elegant script, dating back more than 200 years. Next to each name was a date, and the same symbol that had been tormenting me, drawn in a reddish ink. Some entries had notes in the margin: initiated, accepted, failed. The word failed appeared with alarming frequency. I scanned the pages, a growing fear in my gut, until I reached the last one. There were only 2 entries. The first was the name of my great-uncle Elias. Next to his name was the date of his death, but the space for the symbol and the note was blank. And below it, on the last line of the page, was another entry, written in the same precise script. It contained only one thing: my name. My heart lurched. I slammed the book shut as if it were burning. My name, written in that macabre ledger. It couldn't be a coincidence. My Uncle Elias had been waiting for me. Or perhaps others had been waiting. The silent customers, the lawyer, the historical society. They were all part of something I didn't understand, but that now, suddenly, revolved around me. Driven by panic, I started searching for an explanation. The ledger made me think of the property blueprints the lawyer had given me. I spread them out on the counter. The building had 3 floors: the shop, my apartment, and a basement. But comparing the blueprints with the actual structure of the basement, I noticed a discrepancy. There was a dead space, a section of several square feet next to the back wall that had no access. There was no door, no entrance. It was sealed off. I went down to the basement with a flashlight, my heart pounding. The air down there was cold and smelled of dampness and earth. The walls were irregular stone. I went to the back wall and began tapping it, listening for a hollow sound. Most of the wall responded with a dull, solid thud. But in one section, right in the center, the sound was different. A hollow echo. There was something behind it. I examined the wall inch by inch, searching for a seam, a mechanism, anything. My fingers found a stone that seemed slightly loose. I pulled on it, and with a screech of stone against stone, it slid out, revealing a rusted iron lever in the darkness of the recess. I grabbed it with both hands and pulled down. A hidden mechanism rumbled in the building's guts, and a section of the stone wall sank inward and slid to the side, opening a dark passageway. A blast of icy air, smelling of incense and something else, something stale and ancient, poured out of the hole. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness. It was a small, circular room, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with the same symbol, painted over and over, creating a hypnotic, demented pattern. In the center of the room, on a black stone pedestal, rested a single object, a massive book, much larger than the ledger, bound in a dark, rough material that wasn't leather. With a horror that paralyzed me, I realized it was human skin. I had found the heart of the bookstore, the altar of an unknown faith, and on that altar, the sacred book of a congregation that now had me in its sights. Time seemed to stop on the threshold of that secret room. My hand, still on the stone lever, was shaking uncontrollably. The beam of my flashlight danced across the walls, illuminating the infinite repetition of that demented symbol. It seemed to move, to squirm in my peripheral vision. In the center, the book on the black stone altar seemed to absorb the light, a patch of even deeper darkness in the gloom. My first instinct was to close the door, to seal it again, to pretend I had never found anything. I could go back upstairs, pack my bags and flee this town, this bookstore, and the madness it contained. But the image of my own name, written on the last page of the ledger, kept me anchored there. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the chilling certainty that no matter where I ran, I was already a part of this. I had inherited more than just books. I had inherited a destiny. With an effort that felt superhuman, I took a step and entered the room. The air was frigid and smelled of centuries of dust, and the same stale metallic fragrance as the ledger. The symbol-covered walls seemed to vibrate with a silent energy. I approached the altar. The book was even larger up close. The human skin cover was rough and stitched with a thick, dark thread. In the center, embossed on the skin, was the same symbol of the circle and spiral. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding wildly, and then, with my fingertips, I opened the book. The pages weren't paper, but a thin, yellowish parchment. The writing was a mix of archaic Latin and a series of symbols and diagrams I had never seen. They were heretical, blasphemous texts that spoke of a dark cosmology. They described the universe not as the creation of a benevolent God, but as the prison of an ancient nameless entity, which they called the Silent Reader. According to the book, this being was not made of matter, but of pure knowledge, and its only desire was to consume all of reality, to add it to its infinite library of thought. It was trapped outside our plane of existence, but its followers, the cult, could create a doorway for it. I turned the pages with a mixture of horror and fascination. The book detailed the history of the cult. They had existed for centuries, passing the knowledge down from generation to generation, waiting for a celestial alignment that only occurred once every several hundred years. This alignment would create a breach in reality, a window through which the silent reader could enter. But the door wouldn't open on its own. It required a key, a sacrifice. The book described the ritual in chilling detail. It had to be performed in a place of power, a nexus where large quantities of written knowledge had been accumulated. A bookstore. My bookstore. The ritual required a human sacrifice, but not just any. It had to be someone from the bloodline of the original guardian, the first man who made the pact with the entity. His blood, according to the text, was attuned to the reader's frequency, and only it could open the final lock. My family, my blood. The book was an instruction manual for the end of the world, and I was the main ingredient. Then, among the ancient texts, I began to see another handwriting, more modern, written in blue ink in the margins. They were my great-uncle Elias's notes. At first they were academic, attempts to translate the more obscure passages. But as the pages went on, the tone changed. Suffering, he wrote next to a passage describing communion with the entity. It's not knowledge, it's annihilation. On another page, next to the description of the sacrifice, a single word was scrawled with furious strokes. Lie. Through Elias's notes, I pieced together his story. He had not been a devout leader, but a prisoner, just like me. He had inherited the role of guardian, and had spent his life searching for a way to stop the cult, to break the chain. He had discovered that the ritual was not an invocation, it was a surrender. The world wouldn't be consumed, it would simply stop, frozen forever in the reader's last thought. It wasn't an apocalypse of fire, but of absolute silence. Elias had been searching for a counter-ritual, a way to use the power accumulated in the bookstore to seal the breach forever. His last notes were frantic. He spoke of an opposing symbol, of a sequence of words that could undo the main incantation. But the notes stopped abruptly. His final entry was a warning. They are coming for me. They know I will betray them. Don't let them use you. I closed the book, my hands shaking. My uncle hadn't died of old age. He had been murdered, and the gentle customers who visited my shop, the members of the Historical Society, were his murderers. They were the last members of the cult, and they had been waiting for me to arrive, for the last of the Guardian's bloodline to take his place. The days following my discovery were a nightmare of paranoia and fear. Every time the door chime rang, my heart would leap. The customers kept coming, but now their kind smiles seemed like grotesque masks. Their gazes were no longer curious. They were possessive. They saw me not as a person, but as an object, a key they were waiting to use. I tried to find information on the celestial alignment mentioned in the book. I discovered that a total solar eclipse, visible only in our region, was set to take place in less than a week. That was the date. I had less than 7 days to find a way out. The feeling of being trapped became literal. One night, I tried to leave town, to drive aimlessly, to just escape. But the main road was blocked by supposed roadwork. There were no detours. I tried the country roads, but they were all blocked by fallen trees or broken down cars. There were too many coincidences. The entire town was a cage, and the bars were closing. The cult members were watching me. I saw their faces in the windows of neighboring houses, their silhouettes watching me from across the street. Desperate, I returned to the secret room, to the Book of Human Skin. I had to find Elias's last notes, the key to the counter-ritual. I spent an entire night going through every book, every shelf in the bookstore, searching for any other clue my uncle might have left. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Every creak of the old bookstore, every moving shadow, made me jump. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, 2 days before the eclipse, one of the cult members, a burly man who always asked for anatomy books, came into the shop. But this time he didn't ask for anything. He just stood by the door watching me. The chime hadn't rung when he entered. "I'm sorry, kid," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. Elias was a sentimentalist. He held on too tightly to this noisy world. "But you're different. You understand the value of silence, don't you? It's almost time for the final reading. You must be prepared." Before I could react, 2 other men entered from the back room. I was surrounded. They said nothing. They just watched me, their eyes glowing with a fanatical fervor. The burly man approached the counter. "We know you found the book. We know you read the traitor's notes. It doesn't matter. You can't change what is written. You are the last page of our history, and you will be read." I tried to run, but they blocked my path. They didn't touch me, not yet. They just stood there, a wall of bodies keeping me from escaping. The sun was setting, and the shadows grew long inside the bookstore, twisting like the symbols on the basement walls. The shop was no longer my refuge. It had become my tomb. The burly man smiled, a joyless smile. "Rest, Guardian," he said. "We have a lot to read tomorrow night." They turned and left as silently as they had arrived. They left me alone, trembling, knowing there was no longer any escape. The ritual was going to begin, and I was the guest of honor. The night after the cult member's visit was the longest of my life. The silence of the bookstore, which I once found comforting, had become a threat. Every creak of the wood was a footstep in the hall, every shadow a figure in waiting. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own inheritance, awaiting the arrival of my executioners. The initial panic gave way to a strange, cold determination. If I was going to die, I wouldn't do it like a lamb at an altar. My great-uncle Elias had fought them. He had searched for a way out, and if one existed, I had to find it. I had one night. My search began in the secret room. I ignored the book of human skin. Its presence was physically painful to me. Instead, I examined every inch of the walls, every painted symbol, looking for a clue, an anomaly, something Elias might have hidden. I found nothing. The room was a tomb, perfect and sealed. The answer wasn't there. I went up to the bookstore and began a frantic search. I was no longer trying to organize, but to ransack. I pulled books from shelves, shook them, looked for loose pages, notes, anything. I checked the ledger again, hoping to find a hidden code in the list of names. Nothing. The hours passed, and my desperation grew with every book I dismissed. The immensity of the task was overwhelming. There were thousands of books. Elias could have hidden the key in any one of them. I stopped in the middle of the chaos I had created, dust floating all around me. I had to think like him. Elias was a man of books, a man of secrets. He wouldn't leave a clue at random. He would hide it in a place that was both obvious and personal, a place that only someone of his blood, someone with his same memories, could find. And then, I remembered, the only gift he had ever given me, the only tangible link I had to him. The book of children's stories. I didn't know where it was. I could have lost it decades ago. But I ran upstairs to my apartment and started searching through the few boxes from my childhood I had brought with me. And there it was, at the bottom of a cardboard box, under old-school notebooks, was the small leather-bound book. Its title, Tales to Keep You Awake, was almost faded by time. I opened it with trembling hands. The pages were yellowed and fragile. I flipped through the stories I vaguely remembered reading as a child. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I was about to put it down, defeated, when I noticed something. The inner binding of the back cover seemed thicker than normal. With the tip of a knife, I carefully pried it open. The cardboard separated, revealing a small hollow space inside. And within it, folded several times, was a piece of tracing paper. I unfolded it on the table. It contained a single symbol, one I hadn't seen in the cult's book, and below it, a series of phrases. It wasn't a counter-ritual. It was an alteration. The instructions were terrifying in their simplicity. Elias explained that the ritual's energy couldn't be stopped, only redirected. The Guardian's blood was the key that opened the door. But at the last moment, if the correct words were spoken, and the new symbol was drawn with the same blood, the key wouldn't open the door to our world, but inward. The door wouldn't open. It would become a mirror. The silent reader, upon looking through, would only see itself, and would be trapped in a loop of its own existence. But the note ended with a warning. The energy released would be immense. The cage must be closed from the inside. I understood what it meant. It wasn't an escape plan. It was a sacrifice. Elias hadn't found a way to save himself, but a way to end the cult forever, by taking it with him. And now, he had passed that terrible choice on to me. The next night, the night of the eclipse, I spent in a resigned silence. I didn't try to run. There was no point. I sat in my uncle's old armchair in the office, the tracing paper in my pocket, and waited. Just as the sky began to darken, though it was still afternoon, they arrived. They entered the shop silently, the 3 men from my last visit, but this time they wore dark robes with the cult's symbol embroidered on the chest. "It is time, Guardian," the burly man said. I didn't resist. They led me to the basement, to the secret room. The air there was electric, vibrating with a palpable energy. They had lit black candles, and the smoke filled the room with the same incense smell I remembered from my childhood. They led me to the altar where the book of human skin was open. They ordered me to kneel. The leader of the group, the burly man, held a silver dagger over a bowl. "The ceremony must begin with your will," he said. "Offer your hand. Your blood is the key." I knew I had no choice. I held my hand out over the bowl. The tip of the dagger was cold as ice. The cut was quick and deep. My blood, dark in the candlelight, dripped into the bowl. The leader dipped a crow's feather quill in my blood, and with absolute concentration, began to draw the cult's symbol in the center of the altar. As he did, the other 2 members began to chant. It was a low, guttural chant, and the words made the walls of the room vibrate. I felt an immense pressure in my head, as if a gigantic mind were trying to get in. I looked up. Through a skylight in the basement ceiling I hadn't seen before, I could see the sky darkening, the sun becoming a ring of fire. The eclipse had begun. "Now, recite the words," the leader commanded, pointing to the open book. My heart was beating like a funeral drum. I looked at the words in the book, the words that would open the door. And then, my voice trembling, I began to speak. But I didn't recite the words from the book. I recited the words from my uncle's note. It took the cult members a second to realize the deception. The leader's expression went from euphoria to panic and then to an icy fury. "Traitor," he hissed. He tried to lunge at me, but it was too late. The instant I spoke the last word, the symbol the leader had drawn with my blood on the altar changed. The spokes straightened, the spiral inverted. It became the symbol from my uncle's paper, and the room filled with a blinding, silent light that came not from the candles, but from the air itself. The pressure in my head became unbearable. I felt a presence, a consciousness of incalculable size, peering at the edge of our world. It was the silent reader. But it didn't find a door. It found a mirror. The shriek was soundless, but I felt it in every atom of my being. It was a scream of cosmic rage and confusion. The ritual's energy, being rejected, imploded. The white light turned black, and from the altar, a wave of darkness erupted, not to consume the world, but to consume the room. I saw the cult members scream, but their screams were swallowed by the silence. The darkness touched them, and their bodies dissolved like burnt paper, turning into ash that was absorbed into nothingness. The symbols on the walls glowed with a furious intensity and then went out one by one. The book of human skin on the altar curled, dried up, and disintegrated into a small pile of black dust. And then, it was over. The light returned. The candles had gone out. The room was silent, empty, except for me. The presence was gone. The air was no longer cold. I was alone. A year has passed. I fulfilled the condition of the will. The bookstore is mine. I haven't sold it. I've cleaned up the chaos, organized the books. The secret room is still there, but Now it's just an empty, silent stone chamber. I have sealed it, not out of fear, but out of respect. The townspeople no longer look at me with suspicion. Some even greet me with a genuine smile. I don't know what they think happened to the others, or maybe they just don't ask. I've decided to stay. My life is still silent, but it's no longer an empty silence. It's a silence I've earned, a protective silence. Sometimes at night I sit in my great-uncle's office and read. I've learned that some inheritances aren't of property or money, but of responsibilities. My uncle Elias didn't leave me a bookstore. He left me a choice. And by choosing sacrifice, I somehow found a reason to live. I didn't save the world. I just saved my small corner of it. And now, I am the guardian, not of a dark ritual, but of a quiet bookstore at the end of a silent street. And it is enough. The forest has its own language, one you learn over time. I thought I had mastered it. I'd been working as a park ranger for almost 10 years in the Shadowy Peaks National Park, a sea of trees and mountains so vast you could walk for days without seeing a soul. The silence of that place was my refuge, the rhythm of the seasons my only calendar. I knew the sound of the wind as it passed through different types of trees, the crunch of leaves under a deer's hooves from 100 yards away, the smell of rain before the first drop fell. It was a predictable world, governed by ancient and simple laws. Or so I thought. My only companion in that immensity was Randy. We worked in shifts and coordinated by radio from our respective lookout towers, stationed 20 miles apart. He watched the southern sector, and I watched the north. Despite the distance, our friendship was the only pillar in an ocean of solitude. We shared a dry sense of humor and a deep respect for the forest. We had saved each other on more than one occasion, from an unexpected blizzard, from a stupid fall into a ravine. We were the eyes and ears of that place. The day Randy disappeared, the forest fell into a different kind of silence. It was midsummer, a clear, cloudless day with a lazy heat that flattened the landscape. He was on his usual patrol around the southern perimeter, a route he knew like the back of his hand. His last radio communication was at 3 in the afternoon. He said everything was calm, that he'd only seen a family of wild boars. His voice sounded relaxed, normal. An hour later, when he didn't answer my check-in call, I didn't worry. Sometimes the signal was lost in the deeper valleys. But when 2 hours passed, and then 3, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature began to settle in my stomach. I led the search myself. We covered his route again and again. We shouted his name until our voices were raw, but the forest only returned the echo of our own desperation. We searched for 3 days. On the 4th day, we found the spot. There was no body. No signs of a struggle, no tracks from a large animal. In the center of a small clearing, we found his radio. The device was partially melted, the plastic casing warped as if a blowtorch had been applied to it. It lay in the middle of a circle of scorched earth and grass about 15 feet in diameter. The vegetation inside the circle was flattened, spiraling toward the center, and the leaves of the nearest trees were yellowed and dry, but only those facing the circle. The rest of the forest was untouched. The official investigation was brief and conclusive. A globular lightning strike, they said. A rare but documented weather phenomenon. The discharge would have destroyed the radio and disoriented Randy. Disoriented and probably injured, he would have wandered off the trail and succumbed to the elements in some hidden corner of the woods. Case closed. But I knew they were lying, or lying to themselves. There had been no storm that day. The sky had been perfectly blue. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and silent rage. The park was no longer my refuge. It had become the scene of an unsolved crime. I couldn't accept the official version. There was something else, something we were missing. I requested a transfer to Randy's lookout tower in the southern sector. My superiors agreed, thinking it might help me move on. They didn't understand that I didn't want to move on. I wanted to read the page over and over until I found the missing word. The South Tower was identical to mine, a lonely structure of wood and metal on a hilltop with a 360-degree view of an endless valley. But it felt different. It was permeated by Randy's absence. His books were still on the shelf, his favorite coffee mug by the sink. I settled in there, and my life became a vigil. During the day, I patrolled his route, looking for anything the search parties might have missed. At night, I sat in the observation room with binoculars, scanning the darkness, not sure what I was hoping to find. The first time I saw them, I thought they were airplanes, distant lights in the night sky, but they didn't blink like airplane lights. They were orbs of an intense white light, and they moved in an impossible way. They would glide across the sky in absolute silence, stop dead, form perfect geometric patterns, and then accelerate at an incredible speed, disappearing in an instant. It happened almost every night. I tried to record them with my phone, but the screen just showed darkness, as if the camera were incapable of capturing their light. I reported the sightings, but was met with condescension. They were satellites, I was told, or the refraction of city lights in the upper atmosphere. The stress, they hinted, was playing tricks on me. I stopped reporting them. I knew what I was seeing, and they weren't satellites. The real terror began a month after my transfer. It was a Tuesday morning. I left the tower for a short patrol, a circular route to check one of the trail cameras we used to track wildlife. It was an easy path, barely a mile and a half. It should have taken me an hour, tops. I distinctly remember locking the tower door at 11 in the morning. The sun was high and the air was crisp. I remember the first stretch of the trail, the smell of pine, the sound of my boots on the dry earth. I remember crouching down to examine the track of a bobcat. And then, nothing. A void. A cut in the film of my memory. The next thing I remember is standing in the middle of the same trail, with the sun much lower on the horizon, staining the sky orange. The air was colder. I felt a profound disorientation, like waking up from a very deep sleep. I didn't know how long I had been there. I looked at my watch. The hands were stopped at 11:15. It was broken. I pulled my compass from my pocket. The needle was spinning uncontrollably, as if the North Pole had vanished from the planet. A cold, primal panic seized me. I started running back to the tower, my heart racing. The forest, my home, had suddenly become a strange and threatening place. I reached the tower, breathless. The kitchen wall clock was working perfectly. It read 4:30 in the afternoon. More than 5 hours had passed. 5 hours of my life that had been completely erased. I didn't feel tired or hungry or thirsty, just an immense void in my memory and a dreadful fear of the unknown. I tried to call the central station on the radio. All I got was static, a furious white noise, like a snake hissing in my ear. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. I sat by the window, watching the dark forest, trying to find a logical explanation. Sunstroke, a drop in blood pressure, a mini-stroke. Anything was better than the truth my gut was screaming at me. The truth was that something had happened to me out there. Something had stopped me, and it had taken a piece of my life. As I was turning these thoughts over, I felt a persistent itching on my left forearm. I rolled up my sleeve, thinking it was an insect bite. But it wasn't. On my skin, just below my wrist, was a mark that hadn't been there that morning. It wasn't a scratch or a rash. It was a perfect drawing, a series of fine reddish lines like superficial burns that formed a complex geometric pattern. It looked like a circuit or a miniature star chart. The lines were incredibly precise, impossible to have been made by accident. It didn't hurt. It didn't itch. It was just there. A signature. The irrefutable proof that, during those 5 lost hours, I no longer belonged to myself. Something had touched me, it had studied me, and it had marked me. The search for answers about Randy was over, and my own nightmare had just begun. The mark on my forearm was a declaration of intent. It was a brand, a signature, proof that my body and my time were no longer entirely my own. The fear of the previous nights, a vague dread of lights and silences, transformed into a tangible, personal panic. I was no longer investigating Randy's disappearance. I was following in his footsteps into the same unknown abyss. The lookout tower, which had been my fortress, became my cage. The forest, my sanctuary, was now the hunting ground of an invisible predator. I spent the next few hours obsessed with the mark. It was a dark red like dried blood under the skin, and the lines were so fine and perfect, they seemed to have been etched with a laser. I tried to wash it off, scrubbing with soap until my skin was raw, but the pattern remained unchanged, as if it were part of my very flesh. It wasn't superficial. It was inside me. With a new and desperate urgency, I began to search the tower from top to bottom. If the same thing had happened to Randy, he must have left a sign, a warning, something. I searched through his books, in his drawers, under his bed. I found nothing out of the ordinary, just the belongings of a man who expected to come back the next day. I was about to give up when my hand brushed against a loose floorboard under the bunk bed. I pried it up with my pocket knife, and the board gave way, revealing a small hollow. And inside, wrapped in a waterproof cloth bag, was a notebook. It was Randy's journal. The first page was dated 2 months before his disappearance. At first, his entries were routine. Observations about the weather, the wildlife, small work frustrations. But soon the tone began to change. I read with growing horror as he described exactly what I was experiencing. First, the lights. Silent orbs that dance in the night, he wrote. They are not of this world. They move with an intelligence that scares me. Then, the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I feel like I'm not alone in the tower. There are eyes in the dark, among the trees. My heart pounded as I turned the pages. And then I reached the entry describing his first episode of missing time. Went out to check the east boundary. An hour tops. 4 hours disappeared. The sun had moved. My watch was stopped. I don't remember anything. Just a hum in my head, and a total silence in the forest. I kept reading, my breath held, and found what I both feared and expected. I have a mark on my shoulder. It appeared today. A strange drawing, like a broken star. I don't know what it means, but I know they did it to me. Randy's journal was the map of my own nightmare. It confirmed I wasn't going crazy. I was following a pattern, a deliberate process. Randy's last entries were increasingly feverish and paranoid. He began researching old disappearances in the park, unsolved cases that went back decades. He found a pattern. Every disappearance occurred at the same time of year, during the same lunar cycle, and was always preceded by reports of strange lights. These aren't accidents, he wrote. It's a harvest. They come and choose one. They take them. For what? I don't know. But I feel like they're preparing me. That sentence, preparing me, stuck in my mind. What did it mean? The journal didn't explain. The last pages were filled with drawings of the symbol on his shoulder, and of the lights, and something else. Something I couldn't decipher. The silhouette of tall, thin creatures. The last entry was from the morning of the day he disappeared. It said simply, "Tonight they're coming for me. I'm going to wait for them in the south clearing. I have to know." I closed the notebook, shaking. Randy didn't run. He went to meet them, and whatever he found took him forever. And now I had his same mark. I was on the same list. The silent harvest wasn't over. It had just changed its target. My own experiences intensified. The forest began to reveal its darkest secrets to me. During a patrol, I found a deer standing in the middle of a trail. It was completely motionless, its eyes wide, but it wasn't looking at me. It was staring at the sky. Its body was trembling violently. I approached cautiously, and when I got within a few yards of it, the animal simply collapsed on its side without making a sound. It was dead. It had no wounds, no signs of disease. Just that infinite terror frozen in its eyes. One afternoon, while I was checking the spot where Randy had disappeared, my metal detector, which I had brought just in case, started beeping sharply. I dug into the scorched earth and found an object. It was not of this world. It was a small piece of dark metal, smooth and cold to the touch, with no seams or welds, as if it had been grown rather than manufactured. It weighed much more than it looked, and as I held it in my hand, I felt a faint hum, a vibration that resonated in the bones of my arm. And for an instant, I had a vision, a flash of images in my mind. I saw stars I didn't recognize, landscapes of impossible colors, and the feeling of a vast, cold, and incomprehensible intelligence. I dropped the object as if it were burning, my heart racing. The nights in the tower became a siege. I wasn't just seeing the lights anymore. I started hearing sounds. They weren't the familiar sounds of the forest. They were clicks, high-pitched hums, and sometimes a kind of melodic, dissonant singing that seemed to seep through the walls and make my skin crawl. I began to see movement among the trees surrounding the tower hill. Tall, thin figures, shadows that moved with an unnatural speed, that would stop and watch me from the darkness before disappearing. I knew I didn't have much time. Randy had gone to meet them. I wouldn't make that mistake. My only goal was to survive. But how do you survive an enemy that can erase time and seems to be everywhere? I remembered the last entry in Randy's journal, the South Clearing. I have to know. Maybe the answer was there. Maybe there I would find something to help me fight back, or at least to understand. One night, armed with a powerful flashlight, the strange metal object in my pocket, and a terror that knotted my stomach, I headed for the South Clearing. The night forest was eerily silent. Not a cricket, not an owl. It was the same silence I remembered from the day we found Randy's radio. I reached the clearing. It was a perfect circle of low grass, surrounded by ancient pines. In the center was a rock outcropping, a kind of natural dolmen. I waited in the dark, hidden among the trees. Nothing happened for almost an hour. I started to think I'd been a fool. And then, the air turned cold in an instant. The metal object in my pocket began to vibrate more strongly. And a light, a pale blue light, began to emanate from the center of the rocks. It wasn't an electric light. It was a soft, organic light that illuminated the clearing with a ghostly glow. I stepped out of my hiding place, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. I walked toward the center of the clearing. The light intensified, and in the middle of the light, a form began to materialize. It wasn't a being of flesh and blood. It was a creature made of the light itself. A tall, thin silhouette, with long limbs and an oval head with no features. It had no eyes, but I felt its gaze all over my body. A gaze that didn't see, but read, that analyzed my every thought, my every fear. I stood paralyzed, unable to move or scream. The light creature raised one of its long arms and pointed at me. And then, I felt a sharp pain in my forearm. The mark. It was burning, glowing with the same pale blue light as the creature. And a voice echoed in my head. It wasn't a voice. It was concepts, pure ideas. Harvest, cycle, preparation, and one final word, a sentence. Soon. As quickly as it had appeared, the light went out. The creature vanished. The clearing was plunged back into darkness, and I fell to my knees, gasping, the mark on my arm still throbbing with a residual heat. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. They had marked me. They had prepared me, and they were coming for me. I ran back to the tower, no longer as an investigator or as a ranger. I was running like prey that has just seen the face of its hunter. I reached the lookout tower with my lungs on fire and the taste of panic in my mouth. I took the stairs 3 at a time and slammed the door shut, locking it with the heavy iron bar. I leaned against the wood, panting, my body shaking uncontrollably. Outside, the forest was sunk in a silent darkness, but I knew it wasn't empty. I had just seen the face of my hunter, a face of light and impossible geometry. The word that had echoed in my mind, soon, was a death sentence. I knew, with a blood-chilling certainty, that they were coming for me that very night. My first impulse was to run, grab the emergency radio, the jeep, and drive like a madman back to civilization. But the idea died as soon as it was born. Where could I go? The forest was their territory. If they could erase time and materialize at will, a road wouldn't be an obstacle, and the main radio was already dead, emitting only static. I was alone, isolated, in a small box of wood and glass on top of a hill, waiting for the end. The panic gave way to a strange calm, the calm of resignation. If I couldn't run, I would make my cage a fortress. I spent the next hour barricading the tower. I blocked the only door with the table and chairs. I reinforced the windows with the wooden storm shutters. I gathered everything that could serve as a weapon. A hand axe, my hunting knife, the flare gun. They were pathetic tools against an enemy made of light. But the simple act of preparing for a fight was keeping me sane. With the fortress ready, I sat in the center of the observation room, with Randy's journal and the metal object on my lap. The mark on my arm throbbed with a dull heat, a beacon in the dark advertising my position. Outside, the siege began. First, the lights returned. It wasn't just a few. It was dozens, hundreds of silent orbs that filled the sky, surrounding the tower. They moved in perfect sync, creating complex patterns in the darkness. A language of light I couldn't understand but felt was a net closing around me. Then came the sound. The dissonant melodic singing I had heard before, but now it was a chorus. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that seeped through the wood of the tower and made the floor vibrate beneath my feet. It was a sound designed to break the mind, to undo logic. In my desperation, I opened Randy's journal one last time. I focused on the final drawings, the ones I hadn't understood. The silhouettes of the tall creatures, the patterns of the lights, and one last drawing, the most cryptic of all. It showed one of the creatures, and from its hand, a line of energy shot out and hit a human figure. But from the human's hand, which held a small object, another line shot out, intercepting the first. It wasn't an attack. It was a diagram of frequencies, a cancellation. And then I understood. Randy didn't go to the clearing to surrender. He went to try and fight. The metal object. It wasn't an implant or a tracker. It was a tool, or a weapon. I looked at the piece of metal in my hand. Its hum was louder now, its vibration more intense, as if it were responding to the proximity of its creators. Randy had failed, but he didn't know what I knew now. He didn't know the creature could manifest physically. I had to try. It was my only chance. The singing outside suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. A thick, absolute silence. I waited, every sense on high alert. And then, I heard a soft hum. It wasn't coming from outside, but from inside the room. I looked toward one of the walls. The wood seemed to turn translucent, and one of the light creatures began to phase through it, not breaking it, but passing through it as if it were water. Then another, and another. In seconds, I was surrounded by 3 of them. They were exactly like the one I saw in the clearing. Tall, elegant figures made of a swirling bluish light. They had no faces, but I felt their minds on mine. An immense, cold pressure. the curiosity of a biologist examining an insect. Time seemed to slow down. My breath caught in my lungs. The air grew thick, dense as water. One of them raised an arm. Its hand, a concentration of brilliant light, reached for me. I didn't feel fear, just a strange sense of inevitability. They were going to take me. I was going to end up like Randy. I remembered the last word in my head. Harvest. But as its hand approached, I gripped the metal object. I closed my eyes and focused everything I was into it. My fear, my anger over Randy's loss, my desperate will to survive. I pictured Randy's diagram, the line of energy shooting from my hand, intercepting theirs. I poured all my strength, all my humanity, into that small piece of metal. When the creature touched me, there was no pain. There was a silent, white explosion of light that filled the room, the world. I felt as if my consciousness was being ripped from my body, stretched across infinite distances. I saw galaxies being born and dying, felt the cold of deep space and the heat of alien suns. And then nothing. Darkness. Silence. The next thing I remember is the sound of a helicopter. I opened my eyes. I was lying on the ground outside the tower on grass damp with dew. The morning sun was warming my face. The sky was blue, without a single cloud. The forest was alive with the sound of birds. I looked at the tower. It was intact. There were no signs of a struggle, no barricades. I looked at my arm. The mark was gone. My skin was clean. In my hand, the metal object was gone. The rescue team found me disoriented and dehydrated. They had come looking for me after I failed to respond to radio calls for 24 hours. I told them what happened. I told them about the lights, the missing time, the mark, Randy, the creatures. They looked at me with pity. The medical report concluded I had suffered an episode of acute psychosis, brought on by stress and isolation. I was discharged from the service. Months have passed. I live in the city now, surrounded by the constant noise of cars and people. I've returned to a normal life, or an imitation of it. No one believes me. To the rest of the world, Randy died in an accident, and I simply broke down under the pressure. But I know the truth. I don't know if I fought them and won. I don't know if the object worked or if they simply completed their harvest, took what they wanted from me, a memory, a sample, a piece of my soul, and returned me, empty. The ending is the most terrifying part. There is no proof. There are no scars except for the ones on my mind. Sometimes at night I look up at the starry sky from my window, a sky polluted by the city's light. And in the silence of my apartment, I wonder if the silence I loved so much in the forest was just the pause the hunters take before choosing their prey. I've learned that the universe is immense and not empty, and that there are things in it that watch us, that study us, that sometimes simply come to collect their harvest, and there's nothing we can do about it. My passion has always been the silence of the dead, not the silence of cemeteries, but of words. I am a linguist, specializing in dead and forgotten languages. I find an almost sacred beauty in deciphering a text that no one has been able to read in millennia, in giving voice to a thought believed to be lost forever. My life was a cloister of ancient texts and impossible grammars, an orderly world of verb roots and declensions. The chaos of the modern world, with its noise and its hurry, felt alien to me. My reality was built with the bricks of logic and history, a logic that was about to be demolished. The opportunity arrived as all temptations do, wrapped in prestige and a sum of money I couldn't ignore. A private and very discreet foundation contacted me. Its name, the Gaia Foundation, didn't appear in any public records. They summoned me to an unmarked building in the city's historic district. The office was anachronistic, with no computers or modern phones, only dark mahogany furniture and the smell of wax and old paper. The man who received me, who never gave me his name, spoke with a precision and a lack of emotion that was unsettling. They had funded an excavation in a remote, arid region of the earth and had found something unique. A set of black basalt tablets covered in a script that resembled nothing known. It was an isolated language with no connection to any recorded linguistic family. They offered me a generous contract to be the first to attempt to decipher it. They gave me total freedom and a deadline of 1 year. I accepted, driven by academic vanity and the thrill of discovery. I didn't ask myself why such a wealthy foundation was so interested in a handful of engraved stones. The tablets arrived in a sealed, padded box, as if they contained the world's most fragile artifact. As I took them out, I felt a strange coldness emanating from them, a cold that wasn't about temperature, but about an absence of heat. The script was hypnotic. They weren't letters or pictograms. They were complex symbols, a mix of geometric shapes and patterns that seemed organic, almost like the veins of a leaf or the fractures in ice. Most disturbing was that, sometimes, under the light of my desk lamp, the symbols seemed to move, to subtly change shape when I wasn't looking directly at them. I locked myself in my study, a sanctuary of books and silence, and immersed myself in the work. The first few days were a methodical frustration. I transcribed every symbol, cataloged its frequency, searched for patterns. The language was a fortress. It didn't seem to have nouns, at least not as we know them. Everything was actions, states of change, verbs of dissolution and transformation. It was a language that didn't describe what things are, but how they cease to be. It was a language of entropy. That's when the dreams began. At first, they were abstract. I didn't dream of places or people. I dreamed I was a point of consciousness floating in a dark, silent void, and in that void, I was surrounded by the sounds of the language I was studying. They were guttural whispers, dry clicks, long hisses. I could feel the language's grammar as a physical force. Conditional sentences would bend me, imperative verbs would push me, negations would create voids around me that threatened to suck me in. One night I dreamed that one of the phonemes, a sharp click, cut me, and I woke up with a real scratch on my arm. I would awaken exhausted, the echo of those impossible sounds ringing in my head and cold sweat clinging to my skin. Despite the fatigue, I began to make progress. I identified a recurring symbol, one that appeared at the end of the longest sentences. After weeks of contextual analysis, I deciphered its approximate meaning. It was a verb, one with no direct equivalent in any language I knew. It meant something like to unmake, to unname, to return to a state prior to existence. A verb of oblivion. The discovery sent a shiver down my spine. What kind of culture creates a verb for the act of erasing something from reality? With that key, the language began to open up, and my dreams became more complex. The void was no longer empty. The sounds began to build a landscape. Whispers intertwined to form walls of static. Rhythmic clicks created floors of percussion. The long grammatical pauses became silent, empty streets. I was dreaming a city made of sound and language, a metropolis of dead grammar. And in those dreams, I began to sense a presence. I didn't see it, but I felt its attention on me. A vast, ancient, and terrifyingly hungry consciousness, hidden in the silence between the words. In my mind, I called it the primordial whisper. The nightmare soon began to sink its roots into my waking world. At first, it was small glitches in my own mind. I'd be in the kitchen, making coffee, and when I'd reach for the spoon, the word would disappear from my brain. I looked at the metal object, knew perfectly well what it was for, remembered its feel, its weight, but the name was gone, leaving a blank hole in my thoughts. The moment lasted only a few seconds, and the word returned to me as abruptly as it had left. I felt dizzy, blaming it on overwork and lack of sleep. but the episodes became more frequent. Sometimes, while reading a newspaper, an entire sentence would become a series of meaningless symbols, and I'd have to reread it several times until my brain could process it. I started hearing the whispers from my dreams during the day, very low, in the silence of my study. They sounded like the buzz of an insect just at the edge of my hearing. The real collapse began the night I made my biggest breakthrough. After days of obsessive work, I managed to translate a complete, coherent sentence from one of the central tablets. The sentence was simple, but its implication was monstrous. I wrote it in my notebook, my hand trembling. That which is named can be unnamed. An icy chill ran down my spine. It was the central thesis of that language, the philosophy of a culture of nothingness. I looked up from my notebook. My study was silent, bathed in the yellow light of the lamp. My eyes fell on the wooden chair on the other side of the room, a simple oak chair where I often sat to read. I tried to think of the word, chair. The concept was there, the mental image, its function, but the name, the verbal tag my mind used to define it and give it a place in the world, was not there. It had vanished. It was a black hole in my lexicon. A wave of panic washed over me as my mind struggled to find the lost word, and as I stared at it, unable to name it, the object began to change. It wasn't an abrupt shift. It was a slow, subtle, and profoundly grotesque transformation. The straight lines of its legs began to curve. The 90-degree angles of the back became obtuse, then acute, flowing like hot wax. The texture of the wood lost its grain, becoming smooth and porous like pumice stone. I heard a faint crunching, not of normal wood but a wet sound, like cartilage being bent. The solid form my mind recognized as a place to sit was dissolving into a sculpture of impossible geometry. The object was still there, but it had lost its essence, its meaning, its chairness. It was becoming something anomalous, an aberration. I sat there, paralyzed by horror, staring at the thing that had been a chair. I felt a pang of vertigo, as if the floor beneath my feet had become unstable. I understood the true nature of the language I was translating. It wasn't a record, it was a weapon, a conceptual virus that didn't destroy matter but meaning. And I, in my academic arrogance, was teaching it the words of my world. I was giving it the keys to dismantle my reality, word by word. Panic is an acid. It dissolves rational thought and leaves only raw instinct. My first instinct was that of a frightened child. Cover the horrible thing so it ceases to exist. I grabbed a blanket from the sofa and threw it over the grotesque shape that had been a chair, hiding its impossible angles and unnatural texture. I leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, and began to quietly recite the names of the objects around me, like a spell to reaffirm my sanity. Table, book, lamp, rug. Each word was an anchor, proof that the world was still there, solid and definable. But even as I did it, a part of my mind felt the terror that, at any moment, one of those words might simply disappear, and with it, the object it represented. I decided I had to stop. The work, the contract, the curiosity, none of it was worth it. I had to get away from the tablets. I gathered them carefully, wearing gloves as if they were radioactive, and put them back in their padded box. I closed it, sealed it with duct tape, and dragged it to the farthest corner of my apartment, away from my study. I would not touch them again. I would not think about that language again. But the language was already inside me. That night, I made the decision not to sleep. I knew I was more vulnerable in dreams, that the primordial whisper had direct access to my mind. I made pots of coffee, put on loud music, and paced back and forth in my apartment to keep my body moving. I fought against sleep with the desperation of a drowning man fighting for the surface. For hours it seemed to work. Reality remained stable. The thing under the blanket didn't move, but the body has its limits. At dawn, exhausted, I sat on the sofa for just a moment. Just a moment, I told myself, and I fell into darkness. The dream was worse than ever. The city of sound was no longer an abstraction. It had a geography. I walked on streets made of crackling static between buildings that were cathedrals of polyphonic whispers. And I wasn't alone. Silent figures, made of compacted silence, glided through the streets. They had no faces or forms, but I felt their despair, their emptiness. They were the echoes of things that had been unnamed, and the primordial whisper was no longer a distant presence. It was beside me, inside my head, a soundless voice guiding me through the city, showing me its work. It showed me a square where, instead of a fountain, there was a silence in the shape of water. It showed me a museum where the empty frames contained the absence of paintings. And as we walked, it probed my mind, not with questions, but with a conceptual hunger. It searched for new words, new ideas to consume. I felt it pulling at my childhood memories, at my knowledge of other languages, looking for the words for tree, for river, for sun, for love. I woke with a choked cry. The afternoon sun was streaming through the window. I had slept almost the entire day. I stood up, my body aching and my mind muddled. The apartment seemed normal. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, and when I turned on the faucet, no water flowed. A stream of something thick, gray, and opaque poured out, moving with an oily slowness before dissolving into nothing halfway to the sink. I choked back a gag. I looked out the kitchen window. The street I should have seen wasn't there. In its place, for a second that lasted an eternity, I saw one of the avenues from my nightmare, an artery of white noise traversed by the silent figures. I blinked, and the view of cars and buildings snapped back into place. Reality wasn't just cracking anymore. It was crumbling. I ran to my study. On my desk, my notebook was open, and on its pages, in my own handwriting, were dozens of new words and phrases from the tablet's language, translations I didn't remember making. My mind, even asleep, even against my will, had kept working. I was the portal. The virus was no longer in the tablets. It was in me. I tried to stop it. I sat on the floor and tried to meditate, to empty my mind, but the silence immediately filled with the language's whispers. I tried to read a simple novel, but my brain, automatically, deconstructed the sentences into its perverse grammar. I was infected. I had to get rid of the tablets. It was my only hope. If I got them away from me, maybe the connection would weaken. I loaded the heavy box into my car. The foundation, I thought, let them deal with their own poison. But the car wouldn't start. The engine was dead. The battery was new, but there wasn't a single light on the dashboard. It was as if the concept of electricity had been erased from its interior. A frantic panic seized me. I grabbed the box and decided to carry it on foot, to throw it in a dumpster far from my home. But as I opened the building's door, I stopped dead. The sky, which a minute ago had been a clear blue, was now covered by a blanket of sickly green clouds, and a torrential, almost horizontal rain was lashing the street. A storm that wasn't in any forecast. I tried to call a cab. My phone had no signal. I was completely cut off. The house, the city, the world was conspiring to keep me trapped with the tablets. I returned to my apartment, defeated. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, and I began to cry. They weren't tears of sadness, but of pure, absolute helplessness. The primordial whisper was playing with me. It was enjoying my terror. I spent the next few days in a waking slumber, too scared to sleep, too exhausted to stay awake. The world became a surreal landscape. The walls of my apartment would sometimes turn translucent, revealing the static walls of the dream city. The taste of food would disappear mid-bite. The faces of people on television would become blurry, featureless, like the silent inhabitants of my nightmare. I was losing the world, or the world was losing me. I knew the end was near. I could feel the language in my head reaching a kind of critical mass. It was no longer translating single words. It was beginning to understand the grammar of creation, and therefore, that of destruction. One night, after I don't know how many days without real sleep, I dragged myself to the bathroom. I needed to see my own face to make sure I was still there. I had been avoiding mirrors, fearful of what I might find, but I no longer cared. I turned on the light and looked in the mirror above the sink. At first, I saw my own reflection. A gaunt face with deep, dark circles under the eyes and several days' worth of stubble. But it was me. I felt a wave of relief. And then, I looked into my own eyes, and in them, I didn't see my reflection. I saw the dark void of my dreams. I saw the presence of the primordial whisper looking out at me from inside my own body. An icy terror beyond anything I had felt before washed over me completely. I opened my mouth to scream, to say my own name, to cling to my identity. Ismael. I tried to form the word. The sound didn't come out. The word was no longer there. It was gone. My own name had been erased from my own mind, and as I stared at myself in the mirror, unable to name myself, my reflection began to distort. My facial features became fluid like oil paint. My eyes sank, my mouth widened into an impossible grimace. My human form was dissolving, becoming something anomalous, a nameless thing. With a scream that finally managed to escape my throat, I smashed my fist into the mirror. The glass shattered, breaking the monstrous image. I fell to the floor, surrounded by fragments of my own broken face, my hand bleeding. It didn't matter. The mirror was broken, but the image was still seared into my mind. The language was no longer erasing the world around me. It was beginning to erase me. The sharp pain in my hand brought me back to reality, or what was left of it. I was kneeling on the bathroom floor, surrounded by the fragments of the mirror. Blood dripped from my knuckles, an intense, real red in a world that was becoming blurry. The image of my distorted face, the nameless thing that had looked back at me, was burned into my mind. The primordial whisper wasn't content with erasing my surroundings. It had come for me. It was dismantling my identity, my very concept of self. In that moment, on the cold bathroom floor, something changed. The fear was still there, an icy knot in my stomach, but it was overcome by a wave of pure rage, the rage of a cornered animal. It had taken my sleep, it had taken my sanity, it had warped my home, and now it was trying to steal my own name. I refused. I refused to fade into the silence. If I was going to be erased, I wouldn't go as a passive victim. I would fight. But how do you fight a language? I couldn't punch it. I couldn't shoot it. I had to face it on its own terms. The conceptual. I stood up, wrapped my hand in a piece of a towel, and went back to my study. The chaos of books and papers no longer seemed overwhelming. It was an arsenal. My entire life, my obsession with dead languages had been preparing me for this. I ignored the temptation to sleep. I knew I needed to enter the dream again to confront the entity, but I couldn't do it as a defenseless sleepwalker. I had to go in armed. The answer had to be in the tablets themselves. Elias, my great-uncle, had tried. He had looked for a way to reverse the process. There had to be a flaw in the system, a paradox in the logic of annihilation. I spent the next few hours immersed again in the nightmare grammar. But this time, I didn't read as a translator, but as a codebreaker, as a hunter looking for his prey's weak spot. The language was perfect in its negativity. It had thousands of words to describe the end of things, decay, dissolution, oblivion. But it didn't have a single word for the beginning. There was no verb for to create. Existence in its cosmology was a temporary anomaly. The natural state was the void. And there it was, the flaw. A logic so focused on annihilation is, by its very nature, incomplete. It cannot conceive of its own opposite. And if it cannot conceive of it, it cannot unname it. I kept searching. and I found a symbol I had previously dismissed as an apparent grammatical contradiction. It was a circle biting its own tail, but inside, instead of a void, it contained an infinite, ever smaller replica of itself, an infinite loop. The accompanying text was almost incomprehensible, speaking of the concept that names itself, of the idea that exists solely by its own definition. It wasn't a word, it was a formula, the formula for a paradox. I understood Elias's plan. You couldn't fight the primordial whisper with an opposing force like creation, because that force didn't exist in its paradigm. You had to trap it in its own logic. You had to present it with a concept it couldn't process, a concept it couldn't unname because its very definition was the inability to be unnamed, a logical loop from which its mind could not escape. The plan was insane, a leap of faith into the darkness. I had to enter the dream, the city of sound, and confront the entity. I had to get its attention, and at the moment it tried to unname me completely, I had to pronounce the paradox. I prepared for the journey. There was no going back. With a sharp piece of the mirror, I reopened the cut on my hand, and using my own blood as ink, I drew the symbol of the infinite loop on my palm. Then, I lay down on the floor of my study, closed my eyes, and for the first time in days, I willingly surrendered to sleep. The transition was instant. I found myself standing in the metropolis of dead grammar. But this time, it was different. I was no longer a frightened spectator. I was there, solid, conscious. The silent figures moved aside as I passed. The floor of rhythmic clicks felt solid under my feet. I looked up at the sky of whispers and shouted, not with my voice, but with my pure thought. I am here. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. A profound silence fell over the soundscape. And then, the presence of the primordial whisper descended upon me. It wasn't a figure. It was an absence, a hole in the dream's reality that absorbed all sound around it. It swirled before me, a vortex of silence and the promise of oblivion. I felt its cold, vast mind upon my own. And the battle began. It wasn't a fight of strength, but of meaning. The whisper bombarded me with the language of oblivion. I felt it trying to tear away my memories. The word home vanished, and with it, the image of my childhood house. Then, friendship, and the faces of the few people I cared about became blurry. It continued, unnaming my history, my knowledge, my emotions. It was emptying me, turning me into one of the silent figures that populated that city. I clung to the last bastion of my identity, my own name, the word it had already tried to steal. And in that moment, as its power focused on erasing me, I counterattacked. I didn't make a sound. I projected the concept, the idea of the paradox that Elias had found, the symbol drawn on my hand, the idea of the thing that defines itself by its own existence, the word that cannot be unnamed. The entity's reaction was one of pure confusion. A being whose sole purpose was to unmake could not comprehend an infinite loop. It was an equation without a solution. It tried to unname it, but the very act of trying reinforced the paradox's definition. It tried to ignore it, but the concept was already lodged in its own consciousness. The vortex of silence began to waver, to contract. The city of sound around us destabilized. The walls of static crumbled. The floors of clicks shattered. The primordial whisper, for the first time in its infinite existence, had met a concept it could not consume. And the paradox, like a logical virus, began to consume it. The vortex contracted in on itself, over and over, trying to process the infinite loop, and with each contraction it grew smaller, denser, until with a final burst of silence it imploded and was gone. I woke up on the floor of my study. Sunlight was streaming through the window. The world was silent, but it was a normal, peaceful silence. I stood up, feeling weak but incredibly lucid. I looked at the blanket covering the chair. With a slow movement, I pulled it away. Underneath was a normal, ordinary wooden chair. I ran to the bathroom. The pieces of the mirror were still on the floor. I picked up the largest fragment and looked at my reflection. It was my face, tired, but it was mine. I opened my mouth and spoke my name. Ismael. The word sounded strange, new, wonderful. I went to my study. The basalt tablets were still in their box, but when I opened it, I saw that they were completely smooth. The writing, the language of oblivion, had disappeared. It had erased itself. A year has passed. The foundation never contacted me again. The money they paid me is in the bank, but I haven't touched it. I've abandoned my academic career. The silence of dead texts no longer appeals to me. Now I find beauty in the simplest, noisiest things. In a child's laugh, in a dog's bark, in the murmur of conversation in a coffee shop. I've started writing not about history, but simple stories. I've learned that words don't just record what was. They serve to build and maintain what is. Every name, every noun, is a small act of creation. An anchor that holds reality in its place against a silent void. My battle with oblivion taught me the true power of naming things, and that is a lesson I will never, ever forget. A musician's silence isn't peace, it's a muffled scream, and my apartment had been screaming for months. Music was everything to me. Or at least it had been. Now my old guitar was collecting dust in its stand, a relic of a passion that had died out. Every attempt to compose ended in frustration, in the same dead chords, the same soulless melodies I had written 1,000 times before. I would sit for hours with the instrument in my lap, my fingers lifeless on the strings, feeling whatever talent I'd once had slipping away like water through my fingers. It was a creative drought. A desert that stretched on without end. My part-time job at a warehouse paid the bills, but every box I lifted felt like another shovelful of dirt over my dreams. I was about to give up, to sell everything and accept that my future was a series of gray days under fluorescent lights. It was on one of those nights of insomnia and despair, while browsing obscure internet forums dedicated to music, that I found him. It wasn't an ad, but a cryptic comment in a thread about custom guitars. Someone mentioned a craftsman, a man named Silas, who lived in isolation somewhere remote and built, they said, instruments with a soul. He had no website or social media, just an email address and a veiled warning. Don't ask him for a guitar if you're not willing to pay its true price. And he wasn't talking about money. The idea took hold of me. It was irrational. But desperation feeds on the irrational. I wrote him a brief, direct email. I told him I was a blocked musician and that I needed an instrument that could wake me up. His reply came the next day. It was just as brief. Describe your silence to me, it said. He didn't ask about the type of wood or the pickups or the sound I was looking for. For days, I wrote and deleted drafts, trying to explain the emptiness, the frustration, the feeling of having music trapped inside me, unable to get out. Finally, I sent him a short, sincere message. I told him about the monotony of repeated chords, the absence of surprise, the silence that wasn't peace, but the absence of ideas. I told him my silence was that of a man drowning 3 feet from the surface. Silas's final reply was an account number and a figure. The price was ridiculously low for a handmade guitar. It was almost a gift. Below the figure, one last sentence. The instrument will demand what it is owed. I wired the money without hesitation, feeling a mixture of hope and dread. The guitar arrived a month later. The case was an unmarked wooden coffin. When I opened it, the smell wasn't of new wood and varnish, but of damp earth and old leaves, the smell of a deep, ancient forest. The guitar was a work of art, of an austere and malignant beauty. The body was made of a black wood with reddish veins that looked like capillaries. It had no brand, no inlays, just a smooth, cold surface. As I picked it up, I felt that it wasn't dead wood. It had a weight, a density, and a coldness that seemed to absorb the heat from my hands. But after a minute, the wood warmed up, as if my own body heat had awakened it. I plugged it into my old amp with trembling hands. I expected nothing, and at the same time, everything. I rested my fingers on the strings and played a simple chord. The sound that came from the speaker made me jump. It wasn't the sound of my amp. It was a deep, dark tone, incredibly rich in harmonics. It had a vocal quality, almost like a lament. And then, something incredible happened. My fingers began to move on their own. It wasn't a violent possession, but a guidance, a suggestion. They slid along the neck, tracing melodies I would never have conceived. They were complex, sad, filled with a dark and twisted beauty. For hours I played. It wasn't me composing. It was the guitar singing through me, and I was just the interpreter. The music that poured out was the most incredible I had ever heard in my life, and it was mine. The next few days were a fever. I couldn't put the guitar down. The obsession was total and instantaneous. I stopped going to work. I ignored calls from my friends. I barely ate. I just played. The melodies, the chords, entire songs flowed without end. They were dark pieces, heavy with a deep melancholy, but with a genius that made me tremble. I felt powerful, a reborn god of music. I recorded everything on my computer, amazed that these compositions were coming from my own hands. But the blessing began to show its true face. The music, though brilliant, had a strange effect. It made the air in my apartment feel heavy, oppressive. Sometimes while I played, the lights would flicker in time with the lowest chords. The room's temperature would drop several degrees, and I'd see my own breath turn to mist. I began to feel isolated, not just by my own obsession, but because the guitar seemed to create a barrier between my music and the rest of the world. A concerned friend came to visit. I played him one of my new songs. His expression went from curiosity to unease, and then to fear. "That music," he said, his voice tense. "It doesn't sound right. It makes me feel watched." He left shortly after and didn't call again. The nightmares started a week later. They weren't dreams of monsters. They were dreams of sensations. I dreamed I was in a very dark, cold place, a forest on a moonless night. I couldn't move, and I felt an immense sorrow, a despair that wasn't mine, but seemed to seep into me from the earth. And always, in the background of the dream, I would hear the sound of a rope tightening, a creak of wood, and a final dry snap. I would wake up soaked in sweat, with an alien anguish clinging to my soul. The guitar demanded more and more. If I went a few hours without playing it, I felt a terrible anxiety, a withdrawal. My hands ached. My fingers bled from the friction of the strings, but I couldn't stop. The music was a drug, and I was an addict. It was consuming me. My health deteriorated. I was pale, with dark circles under my eyes, and sometimes I'd get dizzy spells. But the music I was creating was getting better and better, darker, deeper. The revelation came one night while I was in the middle of a recording session. I was completely absorbed, in a creative trance, my fingers flying over the neck. The melody was especially powerful, a ballad filled with fury and pain. I closed my eyes, letting the torrent of notes carry me away. When I opened them again and looked at my hands, my heart stopped. For an instant, the hands moving over the strings were not mine. They were pale, almost blue hands, with broken fingernails and horrible purple marks around the wrists. Marks that looked like they were made by a rope. I screamed and snatched my hands away from the guitar as if it were burning. I looked again. They were my hands, normal, though sore and calloused. It was a hallucination, I told myself, a product of exhaustion and lack of sleep. I tried to calm down, breathing deeply. My gaze drifted to the bedroom window, which was dark and reflected the interior like a black mirror. I saw myself, a gaunt, pale figure holding a guitar. But my reflection wasn't alone. Behind me, superimposed on my own image, I saw the silhouette of another person. It was the blurry figure of a man, hanging, his head tilted at an impossible angle, swinging very slowly. I blinked, and the figure was gone. All that remained was my own terrified face, staring back at me from the darkness of the glass. The music wasn't coming from me. It was coming from him. And I wasn't the musician. I was just the medium. The final chord of the song echoed in the room's stale air as I stared, paralyzed, at the empty spot in the window's reflection where the hanging figure had been. The terror was an ice pick in my chest. The guitar suddenly felt like a profane object in my hands, a parasite of wood and metal. I dropped it as if it were on fire. It landed on the rug with a dull, muffled thud. I scrambled backward, away from it, until my back hit the opposite wall. I stayed there, shaking, my gaze fixed on the instrument. The dark beauty that had so seduced me had transformed into a tangible threat. The reddish veins in the wood no longer looked like capillaries, but like scars. It was no longer my muse, it was my cage. My first reaction was denial and rejection. I didn't touch it again. I put it in its case, zipped it up, and hid it in the back of a closet, under blankets and old clothes, as if I could bury it. I tried to go back to my old life. I went back to my job at the warehouse. I called the friends I had ignored, making up excuses about a personal project that had consumed me. I tried to pretend that the last few weeks had been nothing more than a bout of feverish madness, a strange dream induced by stress. But the silence had returned to my apartment. And this time, it was worse than before. It was no longer an empty silence. It was filled with the absence of the music. It was an accusatory, hungry silence. The first few days were torture. My hands longed for the feel of the neck. My ears missed the dark melodies. It was withdrawal, not just psychological, but physical. The joints in my fingers ached, and I suffered from terrible headaches. The nightmares got worse. The dark forest of my dreams was now sharper. I could smell the damp earth, feel the biting cold. And the figure of the hanged man was no longer just a sensation. Sometimes in the dream I would see him swinging gently from the branch of an immense ancient oak, his face hidden by the darkness. The sound of the rope tightening would wake me with a choked scream. And then I started to hear it, the music. It played in my head, the same complex and sad melodies that I had played. They would assault me at the most inopportune moments, while I was stacking boxes at the warehouse, while I was trying to watch TV. The guitar was calling me. One night the torment became unbearable. I hadn't slept in 2 days. The silence of the apartment was a hum in my ears. And then I heard it. A single soft chord, coming from the closet where I had hidden the guitar. A melancholic sound, a single note that floated in the dark. A question. I froze. I knew it was impossible. The guitar was in its case, unplugged. But the sound had been real. I stood up, moved by a force that wasn't my own, and opened the closet. I took the guitar out of its case. The instant my fingers touched the cold wood, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost buckled my knees. It was like the first drag of a cigarette after days without smoking, like the first drink of water for a thirsty man. The headache vanished. The anxiety dissolved. I plugged it in, sat on the floor, and started to play. And the music returned, more powerful, darker, and more beautiful than ever. And as I played, I knew I had lost the battle. I no longer cared where the music came from. I only knew that I couldn't live without it. I accepted the pact in silence. I would be the medium. Now that I had accepted my condition, the fear was replaced by a morbid curiosity. If I was going to be the channel for a ghost, I should at least know whose. I had to understand the nature of my possession. My investigation began with Silas, the mysterious craftsman. I went back to the dark forums where I had found his name, and this time I searched harder. I found another thread, much older. Someone, using a pseudonym, had posted a frantic message, a warning. It spoke of a guitar bought from Silas, of an explosive creativity, and of nightmares. It spoke of feeling consumed, of seeing shadows, and it mentioned a term that made my blood run cold: sorrow wood. The message ended abruptly and the user never posted again. Sorrow wood. What did that mean? The message mentioned a place, the Hanged Man's Forest, a name that sounded like a local legend. I searched for that name online. I found it in the digital archives of a small county newspaper, hundreds of miles from where I lived. It was a real forest, famous in the region for its dark history. During the 18th century, it had been a place of public executions. The condemned were hanged from the branches of an immense oak that stood in the center of the forest. Hundreds of people had died there. The article mentioned that the oak, known as the Tree of Lamentations, had finally been struck by lightning 50 years ago and had split in half. Its blackened, twisted wood was removed by a local lumberjack. The circle was closing. The black wood with reddish veins, the smell of earth and ancient forest, the nightmares, the sound of the rope, the music, heavy with centuries of sadness and fury. My guitar was made from the wood of that tree, and the souls of the hanged, their pain, their final agony, were trapped in it. I understood Silas's ritual. He wasn't a simple luthier, he was a scavenger. He preyed on the desperation of musicians like me, offering us a shortcut to genius. He used that cursed wood, performing some kind of ritual so that the trapped souls would manifest through the music. But the guitar wasn't just a channel, it was a parasite. The trapped souls gave it the music, and in exchange, it fed on me. It fed on my passion, my energy, my very life. Silas didn't sell guitars, he sold pacts. With this revelation, the nature of the possession changed. It was no longer subtle. The visions became bolder. I no longer saw them only in reflections. Sometimes, while playing, I would see the figures in the room itself. They were translucent apparitions, men and women in old-fashioned clothes, their faces contorted in a mask of eternal suffering, with the mark of the rope on their necks. They didn't look at me. They seemed trapped in the repetition of their own deaths, their emotions channeled through the chords I played. The music was their only voice, and their voice was a scream of pure pain. And the guitar became more demanding. It started to hurt me. If I tried to stop playing, a sharp pain would shoot through my arms like an electric shock. My fingers, previously just sore, now suffered from terrible cramps. And worst of all, I started finding marks on my body. Bruises would appear on my ribs, on my back, scratches on my chest. They were the marks of an invisible struggle. The guitar was feeding on me in an increasingly physical way. One morning, after a whole night of playing, I looked in the mirror. I was skeletal. My skin had a grayish tone and my eyes were sunken, surrounded by a dark halo. I looked like a terminal patient. The man staring back at me wasn't me. He was an empty shell, a vessel being slowly drained. And then, as I watched, my own reflection smiled. But it wasn't my smile. It was a twisted grimace, full of a malice and a suffering that weren't mine. It was the collective smile of the damned, looking through my eyes, enjoying their new voice, their new body. I understood they wouldn't stop. The music would keep flowing until there was nothing left of me, until my own soul joined their chorus of laments. The only way to survive was to find Silas. I had to confront the craftsman who had created my tormentor. My reflection's smile, a grimace that didn't belong to me, was the final confirmation I needed. The guitar wouldn't stop. It would consume me until there was nothing left but an empty shell through which the damned could sing. The fear was still there. a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now sharpened by a point of anger. Anger at the trapped souls who were using me, and anger at the man who had caged them. Silas. The name echoed in my head like a dissonant chord. If he had created this curse, he had to know how to break it. My plan was simple and suicidal. I had to find him. I went back to the internet forums, searching for any scrap of information. The Hanged Man's Forest. It was my only clue. I spent hours researching the history of that place, the geography of the county. I found a small town, almost a village, that bordered the forest. It was a remote place, a forgotten spot on the map. It had to be there. Traveling was torture. I couldn't leave the guitar. I tried to put it in its case and leave it in the apartment. But after a few miles, the pain in my hands and the humming in my head became so unbearable that I had to go back for it. It was an appendage, a vital organ I couldn't abandon. The bus ride was a nightmare. I had to buy an extra seat for the guitar case. Sitting there, surrounded by normal people talking and laughing, I felt like a ticking time bomb. The guitar, even inside its case, seemed to radiate an aura of sadness and unease. The people around me grew quiet, their conversations dying down. A small child in the seat in front of me turned and looked at me with wide eyes, then burst into tears for no apparent reason. His mother shot me a reproachful look. It wasn't me. It was the wood crying. I arrived in the village at dusk. It was a place of a few stone houses and silent streets. The air smelled of firewood and dampness. At the only inn in town, the owner, an old, quiet man, eyed me with suspicion when I asked about Silas. His expression hardened. "No one visits Silas," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It's best to leave him be. He lives in the forest. Follow the old path past the split oak. But if I were you, I'd turn around and not look back." I didn't listen to him. The next morning, with the guitar on my back, I entered the Hanged Man's Forest. The place lived up to its name. The trees were old, twisted, their branches like claws scratching at the gray sky. The silence here was different from my apartment. It wasn't empty. It was full of echoes, of rustling leaves and an ancient sorrow that seemed to permeate the earth. I found the split oak. It was a fallen giant, its trunk blackened by the lightning that had struck it. The aura of pain emanating from it was so intense it made me step back. My guitar on my back began to vibrate gently, as if recognizing its birthplace. Beyond the tree, I found Silas's cabin. It was a small structure, made of the same dark blackened wood as the oak. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. I knocked on the door. No one answered. I pushed, and the door creaked open. The inside was a workshop. The walls were covered with luthier's tools, wooden templates, and half-finished guitars. And in the center of the room, his back to me, was Silas. He was an old man hunched over a workbench, carving a piece of wood. He was so thin he looked like a skeleton covered in skin. "I knew you were coming," he said, without turning around. "I heard it in the song. You've gotten very good, Nelson. Sorrow suits you." He turned slowly. His face was a mask of wrinkles, and his eyes were two dark, bottomless pits. There was no malice in them, only an infinite weariness. "You have to take it from me," I said, my voice trembling with rage and fear. "You have to set me free." Silas gave a sad smile. "Set you free? You don't understand anything, boy. I don't cage anything, I liberate. I liberate the last pure emotion left in this world. Pain, the agony of a soul in its final moment. That is the purest music that exists. I just harvest it and give it a voice. The guitar is not a curse. It's a gift." "It's a parasite," I shouted. "It's feeding on me." "All art demands a sacrifice," he replied, shrugging. "You were empty, and she filled you. It's a fair exchange. She gives you genius, and you give her your life." I realized it was useless. He was mad. He was a monster who saw himself as an artist. "Then how do I stop it?" I asked. Silas let out a dry laugh. You can't. She's too hungry, and now she knows you. But there is a way to pass on the debt. Find another musician, one more desperate, more empty than you. Give him the guitar. She will sense his hunger and leave you in peace. The idea disgusted me. To condemn another to my fate. Never. As we spoke, the other guitars in the workshop began to vibrate. A dissonant chord sounded from one corner, then another. Silas smiled. They're happy to have a visitor, he said. In that moment, rage blinded me. I took the guitar off my back. If you don't help me, I'll destroy it, I threatened. Silas's smile vanished. His face became a mask of fury. You wouldn't dare, he hissed. It would be a waste. And besides, you can't. They are inside. If you break the wood, their pain will tear you to pieces. I knew he was right, but there had to be another way. And then I understood. The exchange. The guitar gave me music and took my life. I had to give it what it wanted. All of it. All at once. I started to play. Not the dark, tortured melodies it dictated to me. I started to play a simple tune, one I had composed myself years ago, before the silence had invaded. It was a song of hope, of love. The guitar fought against me. The strings became hard as wire, the sound distorted. But I kept playing. And instead of channeling the pain of the hanged, I began to pour my own energy into the music, my own life. I played my memories, my childhood, my mother's laugh, my first love, my friends. I played everything, offered it all to the hungry wood. Silas stared at me, terrified. "What are you doing, you fool?" he screamed. "You'll overload it." The guitar began to grow hot in my hands. The reddish veins in the wood began to glow with a dark light. The apparitions of the hanged filled the cabin, but they were no longer in pain. They were watching me, listening, and for the first time, on their faces, I saw something like peace. My music, my life, was drowning out their pain. It was a final song, a requiem for them and for me. I felt myself weakening, the energy leaving my body, pouring into the instrument. The light from the guitar grew more and more intense. With my last strength, I played the final chord. There was a silent flash of light that filled the cabin, and then darkness. I woke up in a hospital bed. A police officer explained that I had been found unconscious in the charred remains of an old cabin in the forest. There was no trace of the owner, or of the guitar, except for a few metal fragments from the headstock. I survived, but the music is gone. Not the guitars, but mine. The well of my creativity is dry. I am empty. I try to play a normal guitar, but my fingers are clumsy, and in my head, there is only silence. A clean, peaceful silence. The exchange was fair, as Silas said. The guitar gave me the music, and in return, it took my ability to create it. It has left me free, but hollow. Sometimes I wonder if it was a sacrifice or a liberation. I've learned that art sometimes demands too high a price, and that for a musician, silence can be both a curse and finally a blessing.